Power doesn't always wear a tailored three-piece suit, and arrogance is often the loudest voice in the room just before it gets permanently silenced. On a freezing Tuesday morning at Chicago, O'Hare International Airport, a black man in a faded grey hoodie and sweatpants held a first-class ticket for Seat 2A on a transatlantic flight. What should have been a routine boarding process morphed into a masterclass in prejudice, assumption, and ultimate retribution. In exactly 12 minutes, a decorated commercial pilot would lose his wings, a gate agent would face the devastating reality of her biases, and a multi-million-dollar Boeing 777 would be legally paralyzed on the tarmac. This is the story of Kaylin Jasson, and the day karma demanded an immediate layover. Chicago O'Hare Terminal 5 was a symphony of rolling luggage, stressed executives, and the distinct scent of stale coffee and jet fuel. Outside, a sleet storm was threatening to delay the morning departures to Europe, adding a palpable layer of anxiety to the atmosphere. Kaylin Jasson sat quietly near Gate K-15. At 42, Kaylin was the founder and chief executive officer of Jasson Aerospace Holdings, a monolithic aviation leasing firm headquartered in a glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. While the general public rarely knew his name, the boardrooms of every major airline in the world knew it intimately. Jasson Aerospace owned a staggering fleet of over 300 commercial aircraft, Airbus A350s, Boeing 787 Dreamliners, and 777s, leasing them out to global carriers. Airlines painted their logos on the tails, but Kaylin's company held the titles. Today, Kaylin was heading to London Heathrow for a quarterly board meeting. Despite his net worth hovering north of $4 billion, Kaylin despised the stiff corporate uniform. Traveling was exhausting, and he preferred comfort. He wore a heavy, unbranded charcoal hoodie, black premium sweatpants, and a pair of worn-in running shoes. He had a simple black duffel bag resting at his feet. With his noise-cancelling headphones over his ears, he was quietly reviewing a PDF of a $1 billion acquisition contract on his iPad. "Excuse me, you're blocking the priority lane." Kaylin paused his music and looked up. Standing over him was a man who looked like he had been manufactured in a Wall Street laboratory. He wore a bespoke navy pinstripe suit, a gleaming Rolex Daytona, and held the handle of a leather Toomey carry-on. This was Richard Caldwell, a senior partner at a mid-tier hedge fund, and a man who believed his frequent flyer status made him royalty. "I'm sorry," Kaylin said, his voice deep and calm. "The priority lane," Richard repeated, gesturing with a manicured hand toward the blue carpet leading to the boarding desk. "They're about to call first class and Diamond Medallion members. The main cabin lines form over there, by the windows." Kaylin glanced at the empty lane, then back at Richard. "I'm in the right place, thank you." Richard scoffed, an ugly, condescending sound. He muttered something under his breath about buddy passes, and stood awkwardly close to Kaylin, aggressively invading his personal space to establish dominance. A moment later, the gate agent took her place at the podium. Her name tag read Brenda. She tapped the microphone, the feedback echoing across the crowded terminal. "Good morning, passengers. We are now beginning the boarding process for Flight 88 to London Heathrow. We will begin with our first-class passengers, as well as our Diamond-level members. You may now step forward." Kaylin stood up, slung his duffel over his shoulder, and stepped onto the blue carpet. Richard immediately tried to shoulder past him, but Kaylin, standing at 6'2" and solidly built, held his ground and reached the podium first. Brenda looked up from her computer screen. Her smile, which had been bright and welcoming a second prior, immediately vanished. Her eyes darted over Kaylin's hoodie, his sweatpants, and the simple duffel bag. Her posture stiffened. "Sir," Brenda said, her tone dripping with practiced corporate condescension. This line is for first class and Diamond members only. Group 4 boarding will be called in about 30 minutes. I am flying first class, Kaylin replied, pulling up the digital boarding pass on his phone and holding it out to the scanner. Before the laser could read the barcode, Brenda put her hand over the scanner. Sir, I need you to step aside. You are holding up the line for our premium passengers. Behind Kaylin, Richard sighed loudly. Unbelievable. Come on, buddy. Move out of the way. Some of us have business to attend to. Kaylin did not break eye contact with Brenda. His demeanor remained chillingly placid. Remove your hand from the scanner, Brenda. Scan the ticket. Brenda's face flushed with irritation. She snatched the phone from Kaylin's hand, a severe violation of protocol, and peered at the screen. She blinked. The screen clearly read, Kaylin Jasson. Seat 2A first class, Group 1. Instead of apologizing, Brenda frowned, her cognitive dissonance actively fighting the reality in front of her. This has to be a system glitch, she muttered, typing rapidly on her keyboard. Did you purchase an upgrade at the kiosk? Sometimes the system issues standby upgrades that aren't confirmed, or are you flying on an employee family pass? I purchased the ticket 6 weeks ago. Full fare, Kaylin said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the authoritative timbre of a man who commanded boardrooms. Scan. The pass. Brenda reluctantly passed the phone over the red laser. A pleasant beep echoed, and the screen flashed green. Seat 2A, clear. She handed the phone back, offering no apology, only a tight, resentful grimace. Go ahead. But keep in mind, overhead space is reserved for actual premium luggage. Kaylin took his phone, casting a brief, piercing look at Richard, who was now suddenly fascinated by his own fingernails. Without another word, Kaylin walked down the jet bridge, the heavy silence of the terminal fading behind him. He knew exactly what had just happened. It was a scenario he had faced all his life, from the car dealerships in his 20s to the elite country clubs in his 30s. The suit didn't make the man, but to people like Brenda and Richard, the absence of the suit made the black man invisible, or worse, a trespasser. But Kaylin wasn't just a passenger. As he stepped onto the massive Boeing 777-300ER, taking in the familiar smell of the immaculate cabin, he glanced at the metal placard riveted just inside the aircraft door. It displayed the plane's manufacturer details and its official tail number, N742WA. Kaylin smiled softly. N742WA. He knew that tail number. He had signed the purchase order for this exact aircraft 3 years ago in Seattle. The first-class cabin of the Boeing 777 was a sanctuary of luxury. Individual suites featured sliding doors, lie-flat beds, and massive entertainment screens. Flight attendants in crisp uniforms glided through the aisles, offering warm towels and pre-flight champagne. Kaylin stowed his duffel in the overhead bin and settled into Seat 2A, a window seat on the port side of the aircraft. He stretched his legs, pulled out his iPad, and prepared to enjoy the quiet solitude of the 10-hour flight to London. He accepted a glass of sparkling water from a smiling junior flight attendant named Sarah, thanking her politely. 5 minutes later, the peace was shattered. Richard Caldwell stormed into the first-class cabin, his face flushed with indignation. He practically threw his Toomey bag into the overhead bin, his eyes darting around the cabin until they locked onto Kaylin in Seat 2A. Richard marched over to row 2. He was supposed to be in 2B, the aisle seat directly next to Kaylin's suite. However, across the aisle in 2D sat a younger executive, clearly a junior partner from Richard's firm. It was obvious Richard had intended to sit next to his colleague, likely assuming 2A would be empty or occupied by someone malleable enough to switch seats. Richard didn't even say hello. He stood over Kaylin's seat and crossed his arms. "You're in 2A. Kaylin didn't look up from his iPad. "I am." "I need this seat," Richard demanded, his voice carrying the entitled bark of a man used to berating waiters and junior analysts. "My associate is in 2D. I'm taking 2A so we can work. You can take 4B. It's an aisle seat further back." Kaylin slowly turned his head, removing one side of his headphones. "No, thank you. I prefer the window." "Enjoy 4B." Richard's face contorted. "Look, I don't know how you scammed your way up here, but I am a Diamond Medallion member. I fly 200,000 miles a year with this airline. I need this seat for business." "And I need this seat because I paid for it," Kaylin replied, his tone remaining infuriatingly polite. "Now please step out of my personal space." Richard turned red. He spun around and marched toward the galley, waving his hand to summon the lead flight attendant, a severe-looking woman with tight blonde hair named Cynthia. Kaylin watched the exchange through the gap in the suites. Richard was pointing at Kaylin, speaking in hushed, aggressive tones, using phrases like, "doesn't belong," and "making me uncomfortable." A minute later, Cynthia approached seat 2A. She plastered on a hollow, customer service smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," Cynthia said. "I'm the purser on this flight. I understand there's a seating conflict." "There is no conflict," Kaylin said. "My ticket is for 2A. I am sitting in 2A. "Well, Mr. Caldwell is a very important frequent flyer with us," Cynthia explained, speaking slowly as if Kaylin were a child. "He needs to sit next to his associate to conduct important business. I'm going to have to ask you to move to 4B. "You are asking me, or you are telling me?" Kaylin inquired, raising an eyebrow. Cynthia's smile faltered. "I'm telling you, sir. For the comfort and safety of the cabin, we need you to relocate." "The safety of the cabin?" Kaylin repeated, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. "Because I want to sit in the seat I purchased. The cabin is unsafe?" "Sir, if you are going to be uncooperative, I will have to escalate this," Cynthia threatened, her voice tightening. She glanced at his attire, the hoodie, the sweatpants. "We have a strict policy against disruptive behavior. Now, gather your belongings." Kaylin locked eyes with her. "I am not moving. If Mr. Caldwell wishes to sit next to his associate, he can ask the passenger in 2G to switch. But you and I both know he won't do that, because the passenger in 2G is an older, white gentleman in a suit. You targeted me because you made an assumption. It was a bad one." Cynthia gasped, deeply offended by the direct call-out of her bias. "That is absolutely out of line. I will be right back." She stormed off toward the cockpit. Kaylin sighed, rubbing his temples. He just wanted to review his contracts and get to London. He watched the sleet hitting the window, calculating the de-icing time they would need before takeoff. 2 minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed down the aisle. Cynthia returned, walking behind a tall, broad-shouldered man in a pilot's uniform. His jacket was adorned with 4 gold stripes. He had silver hair, a thick mustache, and carried himself with the swagger of an old-school aviator who treated his airplane like a personal fiefdom. His name tag read, Captain Thomas Mitchell. Captain Mitchell stopped at seat 2A. He didn't greet Kaylin. He simply rested his hands on his hips and glared down at him. Richard Caldwell stood a few feet away, a smug, triumphant smirk plastered across his face. "I'm Captain Mitchell," the pilot barked, his voice loud enough for the entire first-class cabin to hear. "I'm the commander of this aircraft. My lead flight attendant tells me we have a disruptive passenger who is refusing to comply with crew instructions." "I am refusing to give up the seat I paid for to a man who is throwing a tantrum," Kaylin corrected smoothly. "I don't care what you paid for, son," Mitchell said, leaning in close, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate Kaylin. When my crew gives you an instruction, you follow it. Mr. Caldwell is a Diamond member. We prioritize our loyal customers. You are causing a scene, you are delaying my departure, and I will not have it on my ship. Kaylin looked at the captain's name tag, then up at his face. Captain Mitchell? Are you aware of the FAA regulations regarding passenger removal? I am not intoxicated. I am not violent. I am not interfering with the duties of a flight crew. I am simply declining a voluntary seat change. You have no legal grounds to remove me. Mitchell's face hardened. He was not used to passengers knowing the law, let alone throwing it back in his face with such calm, icy precision. I am the ultimate authority on this aircraft, Mitchell growled, pointing a thick finger at Kaylin. If I say you are a security risk, you are a security risk. You have two choices. You take your bag and march back to row 38 in economy, because 4B is no longer an option for you, or I call O'Hare Airport Police to drag you off my plane in handcuffs. You have 5 minutes to decide. Mitchell turned on his heel and marched back toward the cockpit, Cynthia trailing behind him, shooting Kaylin a look of utter disdain. Richard Caldwell chuckled, clapping his associate on the shoulder. Should have just moved, buddy, Richard sneered. Now you're flying coach. Don't worry, I'll enjoy the champagne for you. Kaylin Jasson sat in silence for a few seconds. He looked out the window at the freezing rain. He looked at the digital clock on his iPad. It was 8:14 a.m. Scheduled pushback was 8:30 a.m. He didn't grab his bag. He didn't stand up. Instead, Kaylin pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He bypassed his email and went straight to his secure contacts. He tapped a name. Arthur Pendleton, COO, Jasson Aerospace. The game was over. It was time to show them who really owned the board. Arthur Pendleton answered on the second ring. Kaylin, Arthur's crisp, British accented voice came through the earpiece. I thought you were wheels up for Heathrow in 15 minutes. There's been a slight change of plans, Arthur, Kaylin said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. I need you to pull up the master lease file for Trans-Global Airlines, specifically the wet lease and dry lease agreements for their Boeing 777 fleet. There was the sound of rapid typing on the other end. I have it. What are we looking at? Look up the tail number N742WA, Kaylin instructed. N742WA. Got it, Arthur confirmed. It's a 777-300ER, leased to Trans-Global 3 years ago. The current operational lease expired at midnight last night, Chicago time. They are currently operating on the standard 72-hour grace period, while their legal team finalizes the renewal paperwork. We were scheduled to countersign tomorrow. Kaylin smiled. It was a cold, predatory smile, the kind of smile that preceded the destruction of corporate empires. Arthur, Kaylin said softly, revoke the grace period, immediately. There was a brief pause on the line. Arthur was a seasoned executive. He knew exactly what that meant. Kaylin, if I revoke the grace period in the system, the aircraft's operating certificate becomes legally invalid. The FAA registry will flag it as an unauthorized commercial vessel. They won't be able to push back. It grounds the plane instantly. I am aware of how my own company works, Arthur, Kaylin replied. Execute the termination. File the injunction with the FAA electronic registry. I want this aircraft grounded. May I ask why we are burning a bridge with a major carrier over a single tail number? Arthur asked, though his fingers could be heard clacking away at his keyboard. Because the captain of this vessel, a Thomas Mitchell, alongside his crew, just threatened to have me removed by the police because I refused to surrender my seat to a hedge fund manager, Kaylin explained. They don't know who I am, and I believe it's time for a practical demonstration of leverage. A low chuckle echoed from Arthur. Say no more. Lease grace period is revoked. System is updating. FAA registry pinged. Done. The aircraft is now legally repossessed by Jasson Aerospace. It cannot fly. Enjoy the show, Kaylin. Thanks, Arthur. Call my assistant and have her prep my Gulf Stream. I'll fly private to London. I'm done playing nice today. Kaylin hung up the phone. He checked the time. 8:18 a.m. Up at the front of the cabin, the heavy cockpit door swung open. Captain Mitchell emerged, accompanied by 2 armed officers from the Chicago Department of Aviation Police. Cynthia was pointing directly at Kaylin. "That's him, officers," Cynthia said, playing the part of the distressed victim perfectly. "He's been aggressive and non-compliant. The captain wants him off." The 2 officers walked down the aisle, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. Richard Caldwell sat back in seat 2B, pulling out his phone to record the impending humiliation. "Sir," the lead officer said, stopping at Kaylin's suite. "We've been asked by the captain to remove you from the aircraft. I need you to gather your belongings and come with us peacefully." Kaylin looked at the officer. He didn't raise his hands, nor did he reach for his bag. "Officer, I have broken no laws. I am simply sitting in the seat I purchased. However, I highly recommend you go speak to the captain before you touch me. He is about to receive a very important radio call." "Don't listen to him," Mitchell barked, stepping up behind the officers. "He's stalling. Cuff him if you have to. I want him off my plane so we can push back." "Sir, stand up," the officer commanded, his tone growing firmer. At that exact moment, the lead flight attendant's intercom phone chimed, a rapid emergency ringtone that echoed through the tense cabin. Cynthia picked it up. "First class galley," she answered, her face, previously flush with arrogant triumph, suddenly drained of all color. She looked at the cockpit, then at Mitchell. "Captain, it's dispatch. They say it's an absolute emergency. They need you on the radio right now." Mitchell frowned, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Tell them to hold. We are dealing with a security issue." "Captain," Cynthia's voice trembled slightly. Dispatch says the flight is cancelled. They said the FAA just flagged the aircraft." The entire first-class cabin went dead silent. Richard Caldwell lowered his phone. The police officers exchanged confused glances. "What do you mean? Flagged?" Mitchell demanded, pushing past the officers and snatching the intercom phone from Cynthia. "This is Captain Mitchell. What the hell is going on? We are fully boarded and ready for pushback." Kaylin sat perfectly still, watching the color slowly drain from the arrogant pilot's face as the voice on the other end of the line delivered the devastating news. "Say that again?" Mitchell barked into the phone, his voice cracking. "What do you mean the lease was revoked? That's impossible. This is a company plane. Repossessed? By who?" Mitchell went silent. He listened for another 10 seconds, his eyes wide, his jaw slack. He slowly lowered the phone from his ear. He turned his head, his gaze landing directly on Kaylin Jasson, who was calmly sipping his sparkling water. Kaylin set his glass down. "Like I told you, Captain Mitchell, you don't own this aircraft. Trans Global Airlines doesn't own this aircraft. I own this aircraft. And as of 4 minutes ago, you are trespassing on my property." Mitchell swallowed hard. The swagger, the god complex, the booming voice, all of it evaporated in an instant. You're Kaylin Jasson." "I am," Kaylin said, finally standing up to his full height. He looked down at the trembling pilot. and you have precisely 2 minutes to gather your belongings and vacate my airplane, because you are officially fired from operating any aircraft owned by Jasson Aerospace, which, if I'm not mistaken, makes up about 60% of your airline's international fleet." Kaylin turned to the stunned police officers. "Officers, you can go ahead and escort Mr. Mitchell off the plane. He's no longer authorized to be here." The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute. The soft hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit seemed deafening against the frozen tableau of shock. Captain Thomas Mitchell, a man who had commanded the skies for over 3 decades, looked as though he had been struck by lightning. The 2 Chicago Department of Aviation officers, sensing the sudden, massive shift in authority, took their hands off their duty belts. The lead officer keyed his shoulder mic, speaking in a hushed tone to his dispatch. A few seconds later, his radio crackled back with confirmation. The officer looked at Mitchell, his expression hardening. "Captain," the officer said, his voice stripped of the deference he had shown moments ago. "Airport operations just confirmed. The FAA registry has red-flagged this tail number. AOG, aircraft on ground. The flight certificate has been pulled by the leasing company. We can't legally let you push back." This is a misunderstanding," Mitchell stammered, his face pale as he looked from the officer to Kaylin. He reached out a trembling hand. "Mr. Jasson, please. I didn't realize. I mean, you weren't dressed like. We can sort this out. I can have you back in your seat." "You don't dictate the terms anymore, Thomas," Kaylin interrupted, his voice cutting through the cabin like a steel blade. "My attire does not dictate my net worth, nor does it excuse your blatant racial profiling. You looked at a black man in a hoodie and decided I was a threat, a fraud, or both. You weaponized your authority. Now, I am weaponizing mine." Kaylin turned his attention to Cynthia, the lead flight attendant, who was physically backing away toward the galley, her eyes wide with terror. "Cynthia, is it?" Kaylin asked calmly. "You initiated this. You decided to bypass airline protocol to appease an entitled passenger simply because he wore a suit and looked like the kind of man you deemed important. Your failure to de-escalate and your eagerness to escalate a non-issue based on bias has just cost your airline this aircraft." In seat 2B, Richard Caldwell was frozen. The arrogant hedge fund manager looked as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He slowly lowered his iPhone, which had been recording the entire exchange. He had intended to capture a humiliating viral video of a man being dragged off a plane. Instead, he had just documented the grounding of a $50 million aircraft by a billionaire CEO. "Mr. Jasson," Richard croaked, his voice cracking. The bravado was entirely gone, replaced by the instinctual, panicked sycophancy of a corporate opportunist who realized he had just insulted a leviathan. "Look, I had no idea. It was a stressful morning. The merger I'm flying to London for. It's a $1 billion deal. I was just stressed. I apologize. Let's not let this get out of hand." Kaylin slowly picked up his duffel bag from the overhead bin. He looked down at Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "Richard, your firm, Oakbridge Capital, manages roughly $8 billion in assets, correct?" Kaylin asked. Richard swallowed hard and nodded. "Yes, sir." "Jasson Aerospace Holdings has a market capitalization of $42 billion, Kaylin stated softly. "I know your CEO, William Gallagher. We play golf at Augusta every spring. I will be calling him from my jet to discuss the temperamental nature of his senior partners. I hope your $1 billion deal in London can survive without you, because you aren't flying anywhere today." Richard's face drained of the last remaining drop of color. He slumped back into his seat, realizing his career was imploding in real time. From the cockpit, the first officer emerged, looking bewildered. "Captain, Tower is ordering us to shut down the engines and prepare for immediate deplaning. They're bringing the jet bridge back." Mitchell didn't answer. He simply stared at the floor, the gold stripes on his uniform suddenly looking heavy and hollow. Kaylin adjusted the strap of his duffel bag over his shoulder. He looked at the two police officers. "Gentlemen, thank you for your professionalism. Have a good morning." Without another word, Kaylin Jasson walked out of the first-class cabin, leaving a wake of shattered careers and corporate panic behind him. Back inside Terminal 5 at Gate K-15, Brenda was oblivious to the nuclear detonation that had just occurred aboard Flight 88. She was currently arguing with a weary mother in Group 4 about the size of her stroller. Suddenly, the red emergency phone behind the podium began to flash and ring violently. Brenda rolled her eyes, put the mother on hold with a raised finger, and answered it. "Gate K-15, Brenda speaking." "Brenda, this is Gregory Pearson, Director of O'Hare Operations for Trans Global," a frantic, breathless voice barked over the line. "What the hell just happened at your gate? Did you deny boarding or altercate with a first-class passenger?" Brenda's stomach dropped. "No, sir. We had a minor issue with a standby or buddy pass rider trying to use the priority lane, but Captain Mitchell handled it." "A buddy pass rider?" Pearson screamed, his voice cracking. "Brenda, that was Kaylin Jasson, the CEO of Jasson Aerospace. He owns the very plane you just boarded. He just legally repossessed it from the tarmac." Brenda froze. The phone nearly slipped from her hand. Repossessed? But he was wearing sweatpants. "I don't care if he was wearing a clown suit," Pearson roared. "He just yanked the operational certificate. The FAA has grounded the flight. 312 passengers have to be deplaned immediately. Do you have any idea what the reaccommodation costs are going to be? The fines? The breach of contract penalties? I'm on my way to the gate right now with HR." The line went dead. Brenda stared at the receiver, her vision blurring. The terminal around her seemed to spin. A loud mechanical groan echoed through the glass windows as the heavy jet bridge was reattached to the Boeing 777. The terminal doors hissed open, and the first person to walk out was Kaylin Jasson. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely indifferent. He bypassed the podium, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, Arthur," Kaylin was saying as he walked past Brenda, not even glancing in her direction. "Have the Gulfstream fueled and ready at the signature flight support terminal. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Tell TransGlobal's legal team we will discuss the lease reinstatement on Monday. Let them sweat through the weekend." Following close behind, Kaylin was the stampede of fury. 300 deplaned passengers poured into the terminal, confused, exhausted, and angry. And then came Richard Caldwell. The hedge fund manager stormed up to Brenda's podium, his face purple with rage. "You!" Richard pointed a trembling finger at Brenda. "You let this happen. You validated my complaint. Rebook me right now. I have a merger to sign in London by 8 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time." Before Brenda could even access her keyboard, her terminal screen locked. A stark red banner flashed across the monitor. "System access denied. Employee suspended." I can't," Brenda stammered, tears welling in her eyes. "My system is locked." "Then unlock it." Richard slammed his fist on the counter. His own phone began to ring. He glanced at the caller ID, and his rage instantly morphed into sheer panic. It was William Gallagher, the CEO of his firm. Richard answered, his voice shaking. "William, sir, I can explain." "Richard," Gallagher's voice was cold enough to freeze the jet fuel outside. "I just received a very disturbing phone call from Kaylin Jasson. He informed me that my senior partner not only missed his flight to close the Reynolds merger, but did so because he was throwing a racially motivated tantrum over a seat he didn't even pay for. "Sir, that's not what happened. He was in my seat." "Shut your mouth, Richard," Gallagher snapped. "The Reynolds team is waiting in London. You are in Chicago. The deal is dead. And so is your tenure at Oakbridge Capital. Security is packing your office as we speak. Do not contact the firm again." The line clicked dead. Richard Caldwell, a man who had woken up that morning believing he owned the world, stood in the middle of Terminal 5 with nothing. He dropped his custom leather bag, staring blankly at the floor. Moments later, Gregory Pearson arrived at the gate, flanked by 2 corporate security officers. He bypassed the angry passengers and marched straight to Brenda, who was openly sobbing. Behind him, Captain Mitchell and Cynthia, the flight attendant, emerged from the jet bridge, looking like ghosts. Pearson looked at the 3 of them, the gate agent, the flight attendant, and the pilot. The chain of bias that had just cost the airline millions of dollars. "Brenda, Cynthia, Thomas," Pearson said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. "Hand over your badges. You are all suspended without pay, pending immediate termination. Thomas, the FAA is opening an investigation into your misuse of authority to ground a passenger without cause. Your career is over." As the 3 disgraced employees handed over their identification, calmer settled over gate K-15 like a heavy blanket. They had looked at a man and judged his worth by the fabric of his clothes and the color of his skin. Meanwhile, 3 miles away on the private runway, Kaylin Jasson settled into the plush leather seat of his Gulfstream G650. The pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Good morning, Mr. Jasson. We are cleared for takeoff. Next stop, London." Kaylin smiled, opening his iPad to review his contracts. "Take us up, Captain." By 11 a.m. Central Standard Time, the incident at Gate K-15 was no longer a localized operational failure. It was a rapidly metastasizing public relations catastrophe. In the modern era, there are no secrets in a crowded airport terminal. While Richard Caldwell's personal recording never saw the light of day, he wasn't the only one with a smartphone. A passenger in seat 3F, a tech entrepreneur who had been watching the entire exchange with growing disgust, had quietly recorded the altercation from the moment Cynthia, the flight attendant, demanded Kaylin move. The video hit X, formerly Twitter, and LinkedIn simultaneously. The caption was simple: "Trans Global Airlines pilot and flight attendant try to illegally remove black passenger from first class. Turns out, he owns the plane." Literally. The internet did what it does best. It exploded. Within 3 hours, the footage had amassed 8 million views. By early afternoon, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and CNBC had picked up the story, verifying the tail number and the unprecedented legal maneuver of a mid-flight lease revocation by Jasson Aerospace Holdings, a quiet but monolithic rival to industry leasing giants like AerCap. The financial markets reacted with brutal efficiency. Trans Global Airlines, TGA, saw its stock price plummet by 7% before the closing bell. Investors were terrified. Jasson Aerospace held the leases on 60% of TGA's wide-body international fleet. If Kaylin Jasson decided to liquidate those contracts, Trans Global would effectively cease to be a global carrier overnight. For the perpetrators of the morning's arrogance, the karma was swift and absolute. Captain Thomas Mitchell sat in a sterile interrogation room at the Chicago Department of Aviation, accompanied by a frantic union representative. The FAA had already opened an expedited inquiry. Grounding a multi-million-dollar commercial flight under the false pretense of a security threat was a severe violation of federal aviation regulations. Tom, what were you thinking?" the union rep hissed, rubbing his temples. "You lied to dispatch. You lied to the airport police. You weaponized the post-9/11 security protocols to settle a seating dispute for a hedge fund manager." "He was insubordinate," Mitchell argued, though his voice lacked its usual booming authority. "He was dressed like a vagrant and refusing crew instructions. He was the CEO of the leasing company that holds the title to your airplane," the rep fired back. "The FAA is moving to permanently revoke your air transport pilot certificate. TransGlobal has already drafted your termination papers. The union cannot protect you from a federal gross negligence charge. You're done flying, Tom. You'll be lucky if you don't face civil litigation for the financial damages you caused the airline." Mitchell slumped in his chair, staring at his hands. The 4 gold stripes on his jacket suddenly felt like a heavy, inescapable chain. Across town, Richard Caldwell's nightmare was taking on a purely financial dimension. He had been escorted out of the terminal by airport security after his public meltdown at the gate. When he finally arrived back at his luxury Gold Coast condominium, he found an encrypted email from Oakbridge Capital's legal department waiting for him in his personal inbox. He had not only been fired, he was being sued. Because Richard had missed the flight, the Reynolds merger in London had collapsed. A rival private equity firm had swooped in and purchased the target company, while Richard was screaming at a gate agent in Terminal 5. Oakbridge was preparing a civil suit against Richard for gross fiduciary negligence and breach of contract, seeking to hold him personally liable for the millions lost in the failed acquisition. His reputation in the financial sector was radioactive. No firm on Wall Street or LaSalle Street would ever touch him again. He had traded his entire career for a futile attempt to secure Seat 2A. At 9 a.m. on Monday, the 65th floor of the Jasson Aerospace Holdings tower was quiet enough to hear a pin drop. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Chicago skyline was shrouded in a bitter, slate-gray overcast, a fitting backdrop for the financial execution that was about to take place. Kaylin Jasson sat at the head of a massive, custom-milled mahogany boardroom table. Gone was the faded charcoal hoodie and the comfortable sweatpants that had caused such a visceral reaction at Gate K 153 days prior. Today, Kaylin was wrapped in the undeniable armor of a billionaire. He wore a bespoke, midnight blue Tom Ford suit, a crisp white poplin shirt, and a subtle platinum Patek Philippe watch. He did not dress this way to seek validation from the men he was about to destroy. He dressed this way because today he was acting not as a man who had been wronged, but as a corporate leviathan collecting a debt. To his right sat Arthur Pendleton, his chief operating officer, methodically organizing a stack of legal folios. Arthur looked perfectly serene, his British composure unshaken by the fact that they were about to hold one of the world's largest airlines hostage. At precisely 9:01 a.m., the heavy glass doors to the boardroom swung open. Robert Hayes, the chief executive officer of TransGlobal Airlines, walked in. He looked like a man who had not slept since Thursday. His eyes were bloodshot, his complexion carried a sickly grey pallor, and his tie knot was slightly off-center. Flanking him were 2 similarly haunted executives, William Harrison, TransGlobal's ruthlessly pragmatic general counsel, and Diane Foster, the executive vice president of human resources. They took their seats opposite Kaylin. Nobody offered to shake hands. The pleasantries were entirely absent. Kaylin poured himself a glass of sparkling water from a crystal carafe, taking his time. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, forcing Hayes to sit in the uncomfortable reality of his company's massive blunder. "Kaylin," Hayes finally began, his voice dry and tight. He cleared his throat and tried again, aiming for a tone of professional contrition. I want to start by offering my most profound, unreserved apology on behalf of Trans-Global Airlines. The events that transpired on Flight 88 this past Friday were abhorrent. It was a systemic failure of our customer service protocols and a disgusting, inexcusable display of personal bias by our crew. It absolutely does not reflect the core values of Trans-Global. Kaylin took a slow sip of his water, set the glass down, and steepled his fingers. His gaze locked onto Hayes with the intensity of a predator assessing a wounded animal. "Robert, let us not insult each other's intelligence so early in the morning," Kaylin said, his voice dropping into a low, resonant timbre that commanded absolute authority. "Corporate values are not the beautifully formatted mission statements you print in your employee handbooks. Values are not the diversity seminars you mandate once a year. Your corporate values are defined by what your people do when they believe no one important is watching." Hayes opened his mouth to interject, but Kaylin held up a single finger, silencing the CEO instantly. "Your gate agent, Brenda, bypassed fundamental airline protocol, snatching my phone from my hand because her implicit bias could not compute a black man holding a first-class ticket," Kaylin continued, his tone clinical but devastating. "Your lead flight attendant, Cynthia, assessed a conflict between myself and a white hedge fund manager, and immediately concluded that I was the trespasser, and Captain Thomas Mitchell weaponized post-9/11 Federal Aviation Security protocols, threatening me with armed police to soothe his own fragile ego." Diane Foster, the HR executive, shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair. "Mr. Jasson, we completely agree, which is why we took immediate action. Captain Mitchell, Cynthia, and Brenda were all terminated with cause over the weekend. We are completely overhauling our corporate de-escalation training and instituting mandatory implicit bias reviews for all customer-facing personnel. Firing the architects of your own liability is a baseline expectation, Diane. It is not a bargaining chip," Kaylin replied smoothly. He turned his attention back to the CEO. "Your people looked at me and saw a target. They saw a black man in a hoodie and deduced that I was fundamentally out of place in their ecosystem. They felt perfectly comfortable utilizing the power of your airline to humiliate me. Today, we are going to discuss the price of that comfort." William Harrison, the General Counsel, leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. He was a veteran corporate lawyer, brought in to mitigate the catastrophic financial damage. "Mr. Jasson," Harrison said, adopting a measured, diplomatic cadence, "we understand the severity of the situation. The PR fallout over the weekend was immense. However, we are here today to rectify the business relationship. As you know, the operational grace period for the master lease on our Boeing 777 fleet expired on Sunday night. We have the countersigned renewal documents ready. We are prepared to execute the original terms, locking in the leases for the next 10 years, ensuring Jasson Aerospace a guaranteed revenue stream." Arthur Pendleton let out a soft, aristocratic chuckle that echoed coldly in the large room. "Mr. Harrison," Arthur said, tapping his iPad, "I'm afraid you are operating under a severe legal misconception. When Captain Mitchell attempted to have the legal owner of the aircraft forcibly removed without lawful justification, he committed an act of hostile gross negligence. Under Section 4, Clause 12 of the Master Lease Agreement, this immediately nullifies any standard grace periods for the offending aircraft and triggers a cross-default vulnerability across the entire associated fleet." Harrison's face went rigid. The color began to drain from his cheeks. Are you stating that you are recalling the entire fleet?" I am stating that as of midnight last night, Trans-Global Airlines is in technical default on 40 wide-body international aircraft, Arthur clarified precisely. You do not have a grace period. You do not have a renewal. You are currently operating those planes on a month-to-month, at-will basis, subject to immediate repossession by Jasson Aerospace at our sole discretion. Hayes looked like he was going to be physically ill. Trans-Global's stock had already plummeted nearly 9% on Friday afternoon, when rumors of the grounded flight hit the financial networks. If Wall Street found out that Jasson Aerospace had the legal right to repossess 40 of TGA's most profitable long-haul jets with zero notice, the airline's stock would crater. It would trigger margin calls, credit downgrades, and a potential boardroom coup against Hayes. "Kaylin, please," Hayes pleaded, the polished corporate veneer entirely stripped away, leaving only raw desperation. "If you pull those planes, you cripple our European and Asian routes. You're talking about grounding tens of thousands of passengers daily. The cascading financial failure would bankrupt us within the quarter. We are begging you to be reasonable." Kaylin stared at him in silence for 5 agonizing seconds. He let the reality of the threat crush the air out of the room. "I am a businessman, Robert. I do not act purely on emotion, though I admit Friday tested that boundary," Kaylin said, gesturing to Arthur. Arthur slid a thick, black, leather-bound portfolio across the expanse of the mahogany table. It stopped precisely an inch from Hayes's hands. "Those are the new terms for the fleet renewal," Kaylin announced, his voice devoid of any warmth. "You will notice several structural changes to the financial arrangement." Harrison hastily flipped the portfolio open, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. Within seconds, his jaw tightened. He looked up at Kaylin, aghast. This is a 15% increase in the base monthly leasing rate across the entire fleet of 40 aircraft, Harrison stammered, his legal composure cracking. "Mr. Jasson, this rate is completely decoupled from current market valuations. Over a 10-year lease, you are talking about an additional liability of nearly $150 million. "I am well aware of the math, William. I wrote it," Kaylin replied seamlessly. "Consider it a premium for the reputational risk Jasson Aerospace takes by leasing our state-of-the-art aircraft to an airline that treats its passengers like second-class citizens. Kaylin, a 15% hike will obliterate our international profit margins," Hayes argued, his voice shaking. "We will be operating those routes at a near loss just to service the lease debt." "Then you should have hired better pilots," Kaylin countered, his tone hardening into absolute frost. "Furthermore, if you turn to page 14, you will find an immediate, non-negotiable stipulation." Harrison flipped the heavy parchment pages. He read the clause in silence, his eyes widening. He slid the binder to his CEO. "A $25 million penalty?" Hayes gasped, staring at the number as if it were written in a foreign language. "A punitive operational reinstatement fee. Kaylin, you can't just invent fees and extort us. This borders on bad faith." Kaylin leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table, closing the physical distance between them. The atmosphere in the room grew suffocatingly dense. "Robert, I can do whatever I want, because I hold the title to the aluminum tubes that keep your company alive," Kaylin said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "But let me tell you exactly where that $25 million is going. It is not going to Jasson Aerospace's bottom line. It is being wired directly by 5 p.m. today to the Jasson Foundation." Hayes blinked, confused. "The Jasson Foundation?" "Yes," Kaylin nodded. "It is our philanthropic arm. We provide full-ride aviation scholarships, commercial flight training, and aerospace engineering grants to underprivileged, inner-city minority youth in Chicago, Detroit, and Atlanta. Your airline is going to fund the education and certification of the next generation of black and brown aviators. You're going to pay $25 million to create the very professionals your crew felt so comfortable degrading. That is the price of your ignorance. Silence fell over the boardroom. The poetic, crushing weight of the karma settled onto the shoulders of the trans-global executives. They were trapped. They could not fight the fee without losing the fleet, and paying the fee meant publicly funding a massive diversity initiative enforced by the man they had wronged. "We'll pay it," Hayes whispered, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. "We will sign the new terms. The wire transfer to the foundation will be initiated this afternoon." "There is one final condition," Kaylin added, leaning back in his chair and smoothing his tie. "This one is personal." Harrison nervously readied his pen. "Yes, Mr. Jasson." "The passenger in seat 2. B. Richard Caldwell," Kaylin said, the name leaving a bad taste in his mouth. "I know he missed his flight. I know Oakbridge Capital fired him on Friday afternoon. And I know he is currently facing a massive civil suit for the loss of the Reynolds merger. He was incredibly disruptive in the terminal after the flight was grounded. Foster, the HR VP, chimed in, eager to align herself with Kaylin's wrath. He berated our staff and caused a massive scene. "I don't care about his scene," Kaylin said flatly. "I care about the precedent. Richard Caldwell initiated the harassment in the cabin. He weaponized his frequent flyer status to demand a seat he did not own, and your staff capitulated to him because he wore a bespoke suit. I want him erased." Hayes frowned. "Erased?" "I want Richard Caldwell placed on TransGlobal's permanent, lifetime, no-fly list," Kaylin demanded. "Furthermore, as TransGlobal is a founding member of the Global Wings Airline Alliance, I expect his ban to be reciprocated across your partner network. He is never to board an aircraft associated with your company, domestically or internationally, for the rest of his natural life." Hayes looked at his legal counsel. Harrison nodded slowly. It was highly irregular to ban a passenger for a seating dispute that didn't end in physical violence, but under the broad umbrella of disruptive behavior, and to save 40 Boeing 777s, it was a sacrifice they were more than willing to make. "Consider it done," Hayes agreed immediately. "His passport and frequent flyer numbers will be blacklisted across the entire global alliance within the hour." Kaylin looked at the 3 defeated executives. They had walked into the room hoping for a compromise. They were leaving with a $150 million financial shackle, a forced philanthropic donation, and the total surrender of their corporate leverage. "You have until 5 p.m. today to execute those documents and confirm the wire transfer," Kaylin said, standing up from his chair. Arthur immediately gathered his iPad and stood beside his boss. "If the funds are not in the Foundation's account by 5:01 p.m., Kaylin added, looking down at Hayes, "Arthur will file the repossession injunctions with the FAA electronic registry. Your fleet will be grounded before the evening rush." Hayes stood up shakily, offering no further arguments. "The money will be there, Kaylin. You have my word." Kaylin buttoned his suit jacket, turning toward the heavy glass doors. He paused, looking back over his shoulder at the devastated CEO of TransGlobal Airlines. "One more thing, Robert," Kaylin said, his voice cold and perfectly level. "When your new flight crews take over my airplanes, make sure they know I prefer the window seat." Without waiting for a response, Kaylin Jasson walked out of the boardroom, leaving the executives to sign away a fortune in the quiet, crushing aftermath of their own arrogance. Power is often misunderstood as the volume of one's voice or the price tag on one's clothing. But true authority operates in silence, resting comfortably in the knowledge of its own leverage. On a freezing Friday in Chicago, a cascade of arrogant assumptions collided with an immovable reality. A gate agent lost her job over a fabricated glitch. A flight attendant's bias grounded her career. A veteran pilot sacrificed his wings on the altar of his own ego. And a hedge fund manager learned that a first-class ticket does not buy you the right to demean another human being. Kaylin Jasson didn't yell. He didn't fight. He simply allowed the architects of their own prejudice to build a trap, and then he firmly locked the door from the outside. Karma, it turns out, is not just a cosmic concept. Sometimes it wears a faded hoodie, owns the very ground you stand on, and legally repossesses your airplane 12 minutes before takeoff.